Hello and welcome to the TelecomTV Summit on the Cloud Native Telco. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content, and coming up now is our roundtable discussion on Cloud Native in a multi-cloud environment. Cloud Native is proving that it can be applied to multi-cloud scenarios in telco operational environments, supporting the trend towards using multiple cloud providers. Now, Kubernetes could be the key to orchestrating programmable multi-cloud managed services. So what are the cloud native challenges that multi-cloud throws up? Well, let's find out what our guests think, and I'm delighted to introduce Miguel Carames, who is Director of Network and Technology Planning at Verizon, Susan James, Senior Director Telecommunications Strategy with Red Hat, Jason Hoffman, President and CEO of MobiledgeX, Danielle Royston, CEO and founder of TelcoDR, and Ildiko Vansha, who is Senior Manager, Community and Ecosystem for the Open Infrastructure Foundation. Hello everyone, very good to see you all. Thank you for taking part in the roundtable. So let's begin. Multi-cloud architectures are becoming more popular, but we're told that over 80% of new cloud applications are written for the cloud and for a specific cloud. So these apps aren't easily portable, which begs the question, why even bother with multi-cloud? Is it for security? Is it to avoid lock-in or single point of failure? Miguel, as our operator representative on the panel, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the answer is all of the above. So if you look at the modern telcos, you have multiple domains, right, that you are playing in. So you have your telecom workloads, you have your back office workloads, you have your OSS and BSS systems, you have your customer-facing applications and content delivery and so on. And the answer is different strategies might work better for each of those workloads. And you don't want to be locked in a particular implementation, or you want to go with the right platform that better fits your need for that specific workload, right? For example, we've been very vocal on we like our traditional telco workloads to run on our private cloud, right, that we build it's cloud native. And then third-party applications and some of the back office applications run on diverse public clouds. So we have the flexibility and we have the ability to choose the right partner for the right workload.
Thanks, Miguel. Susan, surely it's difficult to operate over multi-cloud environments.
Yeah, I think Miguel's point is valid there. When you look at the individual workloads, it's not running necessarily the same workload on 3 or 4 clouds. They're running, say, their enterprise workloads on AWS. They may be running their, OSS, BSS workloads on Azure. So I would say that it's not necessarily the same workload because, you run into a number of those issues when you start to try to port applications across public clouds, and not just across public clouds, actually even within the one cloud, you have different zones that have different capabilities. So, I think those are the sorts of challenges you see, and it's more individual parts of the organization are working with individual public clouds.
Thanks, Susan. Ildiko, have you got views as well on this?
Yes, I don't want to make a buzzword bingo out of this panel, but I did want to throw in edge computing here because I think that is one of the technology evolution and cloud evolution trends that is also kind of pointing towards the need to connect different systems and environments, and also one of the factors for telcos to also look into public clouds. Although, back to Susan's point, different workloads are running at different places. I can also, from where I sit, I can see the hyperscalers are kind of chasing telecom operators. I'm pretty sure that there are some pretty good deals floating out there, but you cannot run everything in a public cloud, and you cannot move all the data and everything into a public cloud, or well, at least I personally really hope so, that's not going to be the case.
Thank you, Ildiko. And that leads us really nicely to our next question, which we're going to address some of the challenges, hopefully. What are the challenges for telcos in operating multi-cloud, and where are the potential pitfalls that they need to avoid? Danielle, we know about the benefits of public cloud, but specifically, what are the telco challenges of multi-cloud?
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot, but I'm going to highlight 3 today, which is, first, do you have the expertise to do it? And I think second, can your team handle it? And, I think the third is when you start to build in a way for cloud agnosticity, right? The ability to move the same workload, because you're afraid of vendor lock-in to another public cloud. I think you're giving up some of those benefits of the public cloud that make the public cloud really great. And so on the first one, you need to have a team that knows multiple clouds well enough, not just the tech and how to operate it, but also, there's a whole new skill in understanding the financial and cost impact of a particular technical decision. I always advise operators that before you jump into running workloads on multiple clouds, try running the same workload in different regions of the same cloud. Even this is difficult to do, and I think it's a really good litmus test to see if your team has the chops and has the capability to do it. And then I think, the last piece, just respecting the technical trade-offs that you might make when you try to run the same workload in 2 different hyperscaler clouds, right? It tends to lead your team down the path where you don't necessarily pick the best tool for the job. You pick the most portable tool for the job. And I'll give a really good example here, which is the ARM chips that exist over at AWS, the Graviton 2 chips, right? These chips give you a 40% price improvement almost automatically. You just move your workloads onto the machines that support the Graviton 2 chips, and you get it. And those chips don't exist on premise, and they don't exist in other clouds. And so, if you're building your workloads to be portable and agnostic, you make decisions to not pick the Graviton 2 chips. So I think be mindful of this. It's a big decision. It's not a no-brainer. You're stretching your teams more. You're requiring them to cover a lot more ground. The environments are changing rapidly. It's operationally difficult. And so I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's not super easy. So those are the things I think you need to consider before you sort of move into the multi-cloud world.
Thank you, Danielle. Well, you've nicely outlined some of the challenges there. So leads us on to the solutions to overcome these challenges. How can adopting a cloud-native approach and using cloud-native practices help with multi-cloud environments? Jason, have you got any views on this?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, for me, having been at least around, cloud concepts for a while, I've always taken it down to 2 fundamental characteristics, and that is that clouds are highly accessible and they're very industrialized from an infrastructure approach, and it's often a company deciding to take infrastructure as its own practice. The usual issues when you look at why people don't do cloud well tend to be around how one is handling your operational processes and the culture of the team itself, more so often than technology choices that you go and make. When we look at the usual issue around, can I put this on a cloud and can I go and put it on multiple clouds? There's both the behavior of the cloud providers themselves, but the real issue is really around your software supply chain. If you're doing all your own software in-house, it's relatively straightforward to be multi-cloud and to make these types of trade-offs and choices. Sometimes the cloud operators even force you to do that, meaning that if you look at things like the API deprecation policies that have existed at Google Cloud, they essentially make people rewrite their interfaces on such a regular basis. It's actually easy to leave. At that point, you sit down and say, well, maybe I'll just move to Amazon, who's not deprecating those APIs as much. But when you sort of look at the fundamental solution to me comes down to what really is your software supply chain looking like, who's fundamentally responsible for it. And you have to start heading everything into really almost this very industrialized approach to your software supply chain, as a big sort of prerequisite to any solution around going multi-cloud.
Thanks, Jason. Interesting points there. Ildiko, I'd like to come over to you to pick up on some of those.
Yes, I also wanted to highlight that when we are talking about multi-cloud, we tend to really focus on the cloud part and not as much on the application workload and the supply chain that Jason mentioned as well. So I just wanted to highlight that I think one of the key solution parts is to decouple the application from the underlying infrastructure as much as possible. So not relying on that specific chip, not relying on some very specific hardware function like how it used to be when everything was a big monolithic piece, like the whole stack was really integrated, built together, and that's how it was delivered. The cloud concept is completely different, and sometimes I have the feeling that we are just really trying to look at the cloud to solve all our issues, trying to look at other technologies like containers, Kubernetes to solve all our issues, because we don't always want to redesign some applications, we don't want to write them differently, but we do need to look into how to make the application design itself cloud native, because that's where cloud native has a meaning. Just because you put something into a container, it doesn't mean that you can put it on top of any cloud that you wish. And the other thing that I just kind of always try to highlight, that we also hopefully at some point will be able to treat infrastructure a bit less of a differentiator, if you will. Like we just got Microsoft on as a new platinum member supporting the Open Infra Foundation. And I think that shows really well that there is more collaboration happening on the infrastructure layer. And that shows the importance of open infrastructure, really talking about how to make the APIs better, how to make the infrastructure better, and how to collaborate in this space, as opposed to just really focusing on the competition and making everybody's life harder on every layer of the stack.
Thank you, Ildiko. And Susan, I'll come to you in a moment, but first I just want to go to Miguel. We've heard some interesting approaches to this solution about how cloud native practices can help with multi-cloud environments. We've heard that focus on the software supply chain, decoupling the apps from the infrastructure. What views do you have on this?
Yeah, so when I heard both Jason and Ildiko, I think they both raised really important points, right? And when you look at some of the workloads that are specific to the telcos, like the real-time applications that we use to deliver your voice calls and your data sessions and so on, the reality is the journey for our application vendors to fully embrace cloud native principles and really decouple the applications from the infrastructure and not need to know the characteristics of the infrastructure and the services that the infrastructure can provide. We are still in the early days, right? So we are enforcing things like CI/CD and so on. But the reality is the applications still require a good amount of knowledge of the underlying application or infrastructure, especially when we are talking about SLAs and very stringent requirements as far as performance per CPU or cost per gigabit per second and so on. So that I feel like we are in like the midst of evolution for us and our application providers. And then the second aspect that I think is interesting for telcos as well is when you look at some of the newer technology, 5G core, service-based architecture, and so on, it's a little bit easier because the standards were created with certain assumptions as far as cloud nativeness and so on. But the reality is even those systems have interfaces with legacy systems. So you're having diameter protocol-based interfaces and at times even SSM-based interfaces that really well were designed a while back without really consideration for how applications were going to run in a cloud environment and so on. So those pose some challenges too, and it brings the need to kind of retrofit telco needs into a cloud native environment.
Thanks, Miguel. And as you say, these legacy concerns are going to be around for quite some time. Susan, I did promise to get back to you. So, Susan.
Yeah, well, you did, but Miguel kind of covered the points I was going to cover. And it was really about those network applications. Yes, cloud native is much easier for your IT-based workloads, for your OSS, BSS, but certainly for your network-based applications, you really do need to have those networking functionality like DPDK and SRIOV and these sorts of things, just simply from a cost perspective. So for them to perform as they should, those are going to be considerations that are still going to take some time to get in place on a public cloud.
And Jason, would you like to come back now that we've heard some more comments from our guests?
If I could, yeah. Sometimes the use of a word like cloud native, can be the challenge, meaning that we often talk about how things are going, but we're not sort of talking about necessarily why we would go do something. I think as, Miguel was just talking about the realities that any operator is in, most of them are procuring software from other people and systems from other people. And of course, the cloud native concept for me has always been, an interesting one in that it's typically defined as how do you do a very resilient and reliable application on potentially unreliable infrastructure with variable ownership. That almost is one end that you have to consider around, your software design. But then there's also the other reality, like when, our colleague here was talking about the Graviton chips from AWS, is that there's also the reality that anytime that you want something that is a repetitive computational task, you want that actually in hardware. You'll end up with a specialized piece of hardware that'll do that 1,000, 10,000 times faster than that piece of software will do it. And often this idea that we're sort of bouncing from, one extreme to the other, it's a little bit like the thinking of whether you're going to centralize a workload or decentralize a workload, centralize a workload or decentralize a workload, when really the sort of realization is that those two are like a subset of a distributed system. And the fundamental question you have to address as an organization is, how do we up level it from much more of an engineering perspective, where we say, how are we good as an organization at doing distributed systems where we can make decisions that they're centralized or decentralized or distributed or sort of moved around? And, how do we go from the type of generationally improving, unit economics and software updates that we do in the telecom space and just make everything much more continuous? And I think when we get down to, sometimes some of these realities of what you have to address within any sort of modern operator, it does come down to making those types of trade-offs much more so than this question of, am I going to go cloud native or not?
I have another statistic here, and this one's from the CNCF cloud report of last year. There's a new one due anytime now, but we've got last year's one as the current one. The stat is 93% of enterprises have a strategy to use multiple providers. Now that's pretty comprehensive. So will a maturing Kubernetes, along with its associated APIs, unlock programmatic multi-cloud managed services? Now we've already seen a number of projects. There were a few from the ONF, cross-plane and dual mode control plane, for example. I'm sure there's a lot more. Those are looking to add cloud native capabilities to scalable multi-cloud deployments. So going back to the question, Susan, is Kubernetes at least part of the answer?
Yes, Guy, it's part of the answer, but it's not the total answer. And Kubernetes is still continuing to evolve. So it's where you start, and then you need to add things like service mesh, advanced security, advanced cluster management, and multi-tenancy. All of these things are things that need to be in place. And they're the sorts of things that we've been working on over the last year or so with service providers to make sure that when they're deploying on-prem, they have the capabilities that they need. But also when we take those workloads to the public cloud, that they're available there as well. So, it's continuing to evolve.
Thanks, Susan. Ildiko.
I just wanted to say, building on what Susan said, that I also see how Kubernetes is developing, and I hear people kind of talking about Kubernetes as cloud infrastructure as well, or at least the conversation kind of sounds like it. And I think if we are not careful in terms of what functionality makes its way into Kubernetes and what is the functionality that will remain in the underlying cloud infrastructure that Kubernetes was designed to come on top of, then we might get ourselves into trouble and turn Kubernetes into just one of those clouds and yet another cloud that will face the exact same challenges that we have with all the other clouds out there. So I think it is really important to do the design decisions right, and really make sure that we can stick to the sort of single responsibility principles on the way as much as possible. And also collaboration, as always, between infrastructure and the application layer is key from both sides.
Thanks, Ildiko. And Danielle, is a maturing Kubernetes ecosystem the answer?
I'm going to be a little bit extreme. I think that's why I really like doing these panels and participating in forums like this, because I like to offer an alternative perspective here. When I talk to vendors and look at what people are calling cloud native, a lot of people associate the fact that they're using Kubernetes is kind of like the, full stop. If I use Kubernetes, I'm therefore cloud native. And I think there's a big danger because people think that, when something is cloud native, you get all the benefits of for example, a public cloud, cost savings, feature velocity, CI/CD, all those cool things. And just because you're using Kubernetes, it's not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet. Sometimes it's the right thing. I think it's really important to have design decisions and important technical decisions of when it's the right thing to do. Use it. It's really nice because you can move an application pretty quickly up into the public cloud by putting it into a Kubernetes container. But I think don't stop there. I think you really need to start looking at refactoring the application, coupling it with the particular services of a public cloud. Like Miguel said in his first answer, looking at the clouds, they do have different capabilities and you may pick them for different things. Think through that. Don't just dump it into a Kubernetes container and move it up and you're done. I think it's a lot, public cloud, and using the public cloud correctly is a lot more than Kubernetes, and it's running there. I think it's really starting to understand the software capabilities of the public cloud and starting to leverage that for your workloads.
Absolutely, Danielle. And as we've been learning these 3 years of doing the Cloud Native Telco Summit, it's as much about culture and methodology as any particular technologies or technical approaches. Jason, you'd like to come in on this point about, is Kubernetes the answer?
My basic response to that is no individual technology is ever, quote unquote, the answer. I think the question is really, you can think about sort of a traditional waterfall standards-based process or the sort of emergent iterative de facto standardization that sort of occurs. For example, things like the object store from AWS S3 is that API has become the de facto standard for everybody else's object store design because it emerged that way. It wasn't purposefully done. If I look at Kubernetes is a de facto standard from an API perspective for certain interactions with infrastructure. It gives you a great degree of portability and interoperability, but it's about as technically interesting as the palette. Meaning that these are just packaging mechanisms that you go and do. A container is like a cardboard box you put your application in. A pallet's the thing that you stack a bunch of cardboard boxes on side of. It still goes inside of a larger container that goes inside of a ship that's part of a supply chain, that there's a bigger sort of like story to it. Is the pallet and the cardboard box and the container ship designs absolutely critical to modern supply chains? Yes. Is it like the thing? It depends on one's perspective. And Kubernetes is in the same spot. It's packaging.
I love the analogy, Jason. Thanks for that. Yes, Kubernetes packaging. I want to stick with Kubernetes for our final question, because we've just got time for one more topic in this particular roundtable. Kubernetes has led to, or arguably led to, containers as a service model, which is starting to become a viable enabler for hybrid cloud and multi-cloud deployments. Is this a development that telcos can leverage, do we think? And if so, how? Ildiko, sorry to put you on the spot, but maybe I might come to you here about this idea of containers as a service.
It's all good. I think when it comes to containers as a service, I just would like to go back to Jason's and Danielle's and well, practically everybody else's point from earlier in terms of I think it is viable for telcos as well. But I think when it comes to leveraging it, we need to just also not just look into the technology itself, but also look into things like automation, for instance, like some of the telco workloads and ways of working is they are becoming a bit more enterprise-like. And I think in that sense, when we are approaching this area as well, there are a lot of things that telcos can leverage when it comes to like continuous integration and deployment, how to automate the operation of the environment, and how to utilize the different tools. You mentioned Crossplane. I could throw in Airship in here. How you manage the life cycle of your containerized infrastructure services, and just how you're trying to make sure that you have everything available that your workload needs.
Thanks very much for that, Ildiko. And Susan, you'd like to add some views to this one?
Yeah, I think, there's just one additional thing I'd like to add to Ildiko's answer. I think container as a service is certainly something that they certainly can take advantage of. I think one of the traps that you can fall into is that if you do that in-house and you think this is great, we can continue to work with this, you really need to make sure that you're going back to the community with any of those additions that you're making. I think one of the challenges we definitely have seen in the past is when you've sort of continued to build on your own capabilities, when the next generation comes out, 2 or 3 releases down the track, someone else will solve those capability issues. And, if you haven't upstreamed that code base, you can get isolated very easily, and it's extremely costly to come back. So if you do it in a open source way, or you have a mechanism for upstreaming those additions that you make, I think that's absolutely an interesting concept to embrace.
Thanks, Susan. Miguel, I wonder if I could just ask you the same question. Are new models like containers as a service, are they viable to telcos to consider to help them with their multi-cloud activities?
Yeah, I think they are viable. We and I guess our competitors and our peers are looking into them. I think if nothing else, we are learning kind of like good cloud native hygiene. Maybe that's the way I could put it. I like the making sure that we partner with our application providers and our infra providers and the cloud stack providers to really build applications for a different environment. And so if you look at some of the kind of what the solutions look like today, and Ildiko made the point that increasingly we telcos play more in the enterprise domain, like think about private networks and so on. The reality is we are dealing now with like completely different environments, right? And I like to talk about every real estate asset that we have becomes a data center effectively, right? So you want to be able to place some workloads in each of those data center types that are unique. They have different characteristics that serve a use case, right? A very specific use case, whether it's very low latency and very reliable communications, very far into the edge. And the reality is, if you haven't applied all these things we've been talking about with the, building the applications to leverage the capabilities from the platform, getting the applications built as microservices that can scale up and down, leveraging what Kubernetes does well, and so on. If you don't do that, quite frankly, it'll be almost impossible to be able to deliver optimized applications for all these very diverse environments. Think about massive data centers that are centralized, that run some of your control plane workloads, and then like effectively like they run right all the way at the edge where it's an enclosure. That's all you have. But you have needs to run workloads there that are completely different than what we used in the past. It's not just run, it's part of the core and third-party applications. So I think these are all building blocks that we're getting. We're leveraging to solve these very like new problems for us, if you go, right? Like the expectations are higher, the pressures are higher too, and we have to consider every possible option, really.
Sure. Thank you, Miguel, for that. And over to you, Danielle.
Yeah, I think one thing that we haven't really mentioned in depth, we spent some time on Kubernetes, but I think also understanding that the public cloud providers are providing modularized blocks of code and functionality that is accessible completely through an API. It makes it really easy to switch and play and try different things where they're charging you by the usage, right? You're not doing this big, huge investment. So you can start with a really small experiment, try it out. And I think for operators, and vendors alike, where we are early days on figuring out, which hyperscaler is going to win. Am I putting, all my eggs in one basket? Who should I pick? I think what we're going to start to see is a real emergence of API-based programming, right? Up and down, not just at the lowest levels, and not just at the public cloud. And it's certainly what we're doing over at ToTogi, where we are programming against the TN Forum open APIs. They're open, they're non-proprietary, anyone can code against them. And coupling open APIs in a telco setting connected to a public cloud API just really sort of opens up the possibility of what kind of applications, how quickly we can build the applications. And so I agree with Miguel from his beginning. This is early days. Let's see how it evolves and works out. But I think APIs is going to be a big story as we look towards 2022 and building new applications for the future.
Well, it certainly promised a lot. Let's see if it actually delivers on its promise as we go into next year. I think that's actually a very good place for us to stop the discussion now. We're about 30 minutes into our roundtable, so let's bring it to a close. Thank you all very much indeed for participating and sharing your views and opinions. Now, if you're watching this on day one of our TelecomTV Summit on the Cloud Native Telco, and don't forget, send us any questions you have and we'll try and answer them in our live after show program later today. And please take part in our online poll. You can find it below this video play window next to the Q&A app. All of today's programs are available to view online here at TelecomTV, and we'll be back tomorrow with more roundtable discussions for you. Until then, thanks for watching and goodbye.